All right, this is the last lesson in Acts. Next week will be in Exodus and Leviticus. There's books up on the little cabinet over there. If you don't have one, be sure and get one. But today's lesson is entitled Trust. And it's taken from Acts 27. Trust. Taken from Acts 27, verses 31 through 44. So if you allow me, I'll read the printed text and we'll come back and we'll discuss it. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, "This day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you." And when he had thus spoken, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were in all in the ship 216 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoised up the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart struck fast and remained unmovable. But the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they should swim. They that could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. All right, now, what we've got is Paul appealed to Caesar his conviction. And he was in Caesarea, so being a Roman citizen, he got access to Caesar, who was the ultimate authority. He was kind of like the Supreme Court. You know, he was the last stop. Whatever he said went. He was the expert in the law and everything else. So Paul appealed to Caesar. So he was going to go to Rome. And there was other prisoners with him and everything else. And they assigned a centurion by the name of Julius. And the centurion was generally over 100 soldiers. And typically in the New Testament, centurions are looked on in a favorable light. You know, we had a lot of good things, Cornelius and some folks that were centurions and did good things. So anyway, they get on the ship, and as they're sailing, they trying to decide whether we should try to wait for spring or go now. And Paul said, "My advice is we wait for spring." And then the captain of the ship said, "No, we can do it." So they start off sailing, and they sail right into a nor'easter. And they call it something like a Eurocyclone or something like that, but it's a nor'easter. And so they sailed right into this, and it's terrible. And it's continually dark because the clouds are so bad and everything else. They can't even see daylight. They're busy. They're crying out to all their different gods, and they're probably getting seasick and just all kind of stuff. Well, they hadn't eaten for 14 days. Now, whether they were fasting, whether they were just too busy to eat, or whether they were too sick to eat, don't really know. But they hadn't eaten in 14 days. They hadn't seen daylight. They didn't know where they were. They were just in a bad way. Well, God spoke to Paul through an angel and said, "As long as you all remain in the ship, the ark, you'll be safe." Okay? So he expressed that, and this is kind of where we pick up over here. Starting off with verse 31.
Mike, in the back of the quarterly, there's a map that shows his route and where he shipwrecked.
Maltus.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll get there. But Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Now this is a direct word from God to Paul through an angel. Paul was in a position with God where no matter what state he was in, therewith he was content, because he knew that he was in God's care and God had control of his life. Now, what's the real reason Paul's headed to Rome to stand before Caesar? Missionary trip, exactly right. This is going to be his last. Take the gospel to all the world. Well, my goodness, this is a coup to stand before Caesar and share the gospel. This is all still part of God's plan. God's constantly got his hand on Paul. He's going to take care of Paul because Paul is submitted to God's will and he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. So he's not worried about nothing because God's got a plan and God's going to see it through. So the centurion, a guy named Julius, is in charge of, this expedition, so to speak. Well, this is going to emphasize Julius's respect and benevolence toward Paul throughout this account, because right off the bat, after God spoke to Paul through the angel, he told Julius, everybody needs to stay in this boat if they want to be saved. Okay? Now, what would you do if you didn't stay in the boat? Well, I mean, what are you thinking? You going to jump in the sea? They're out in the middle of the ocean. And I'd say those are big waves. How would you just jump overboard? Lifeboat. How were those lifeboats set up? Were they rafts? Didn't have rafts back then, did they? They had smaller wooden boats that were tied on the side of the big boat. Now these boats were used to ferry people back and forth to shore, to get down in and do repair work on the ship, various things, and they have them tied up on the side of the big ship. My opinion, that's a way of escape. Jumping into the ocean is probably not a good idea. God might provide another big whale or something more sinister. But God said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except you stay in this ship, you cannot be saved. So, on Paul's recommendation, he also gave him a little tip. Hey, there's some of these guys that are planning an escape. So he relayed to them. Now, was Paul being a rat or was he preserving life? He was preserving life. Because God said, if you leave this boat, you're going to die. And there's people that are planning on escaping in these lifeboats. They'll die. So Paul tells them this. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. So they took Paul's advice. They went over to the lifeboats, cut the ropes that were holding them, and let them fall into the sea and be gone forever. Again, Julius is in control. He's listening to what Paul has to say. Now, there's a reason for all of this, and we'll see that later on here, what's going on. And then verse 33. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Okay, night and day really was pretty much being able to visualize and see things undistinguishable because of this nor'easter. And they've gone 14 days without eating. Now, that's going to cause somebody to be weak, right? You need nourishment. You need to replenish what you burn, what you've spent, all these calories. So Paul said, the day is coming on. Now, I think Paul knew something's getting ready to happen. Of course he did. God's given Paul the direction to do. I want you all to eat. because you're going to need your strength. You've gone 14 days without food. Paul informed Julius about God's promise and warned him of the sailors' plans to cut the boat. Okay? Then he said, I want you all to eat, get ready, because something's coming. This is the third time that Paul's taken a leadership role in this journey, and they're listening to him. Then in verse 34 it says, Wherefore, I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. Now that word health kind of has a double meaning here. The word refers to preservation, prosperity, or deliverance. Okay? I want you to take some meat, for this is for your health. The word translated health, which is soteria or soteria, is also used throughout the New Testament for spiritual salvation. Spiritual salvation. Paul is ministering from the Lord in a spiritual context as well as a physical. But Paul's ulterior motive in everything he does is for the spiritual. He's wanting people to know Jesus Christ. That's his ultimate goal. That's his race that he's running, is to tell as many people about Jesus Christ as he possibly can, so they have the opportunity to choose or reject Christ. So here, I want you to take some meat for your health. Number one, to sustain you for what's getting ready to come about that we're going to need to do, but also to give you an opportunity to be able to be with me longer to learn more about Jesus for some spiritual healing. It's a beautiful picture what's being portrayed here. And this is how God works. And when you are submitted to God's will and God's plan, He can do things through you.
I think as a caveat, that you were talking earlier, about Paul, being content wherever he was and so forth, and trusting in the Lord as long as you're in the will of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
You can trust Him, but sometimes we tend to stray.
Yeah.
And then He's going to bring us back around. But as long as you're, and Paul was.
Oh, yeah.
In the will of God, doing what he wanted, so he could trust and believe.
That's a good place to be, isn't it? Maybe it's something we should all strive for.
Wouldn't hurt, would it?
Well, it hurts. And then he said, if you'll do this, then there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. Anybody ever heard that little idiom before? Not a hair shall fall from you. That goes way back. Do you know it was that old? Paul assured the passengers of their safety using this old proverbial phrase, not a hair shall fall from your head. So Paul was assuring them, as long as they stayed in the boat, through this, they're going to be saved. Now, eventually, you're going to have to get out of the boat. But through this period of time, you need to stay in the boat. Okay? All right, let's go there and see what he says in verses number 35 through 38. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Here's the picture. They're in this boat. They've got food. They've got provisions. Paul takes some bread. He breaks it. He blesses it. And begins to eat it. What's that a picture of?
Last Supper.
Yeah, Lord's Supper. Now, this is not the Lord's Supper because that is only done amongst believers. There's probably only 3 or 4 Christians on this boat. But it's a picture of a Jewish custom in how they would eat. Okay? So, he took the bread, broke it, blessed it, and then ate. Now, the blessing is the crucial point here. He's asking God to bless it, to bless the people that eat it, to give them the strength that they need. Again, pointing everybody towards God. And there's a whole mishmash of people on here. Because when they were out there in the boat and they're all hollering out to their gods, and they might have been fasting to offer themselves to the gods or whatever. There's all kinds of them. So Paul took the bread after the Jewish custom, broke it, blessed it, and ate. In verse 36, then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. Now it's interesting how things catch hold when somebody starts. They hadn't eaten in 14 days. Now, man, I'd be chewing off my arm. They're standing there, of course, Paul eats, and when they see him eat, they get happy and encouraged. Now, I think Paul's demeanor had a great effect upon people, that he stayed calm. Paul always stayed calm through crisis because he knew who was in control. He's in a ship that they're all convinced they're going to be lost, and yet Paul's calm and he's having a sandwich. So he said, cool, all right, I like that, let's do that. So they were all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. After Paul's prayer, the entire ship's population was of good cheer and strengthened. Paul's optimism, rooted in his faith in God, proved to be contagious. There again, everything about Paul focuses on God. How can I serve God? How can I present God? How can I further the kingdom of God? This is all about Paul. This is who he is. So they were all happy and they all took food. How many people were on that boat? Good. And we were in all, in the ship, 216 souls. So y'all can transfer stuff. 216. How do we ever get the score for 20? Anybody know how that got started?
I think Abraham Lincoln started.
4 score? Yeah, could be when I first heard of it. But there's 276 people on this boat. Why in the world does that matter? Why would Luke say that?
Because you got to account for everyone.
You got to account for everyone. But you think about this ship. That was a big ship. Yeah, it was a big ship. 276 people on this boat, and it's out there in this ocean being tossed all over the place and just all kind of stuff going on. And yet, not one was lost. I think that's what Luke was pointing out, is the power of God to keep those that he said he's going to keep.
And Paul was a prisoner
Yeah,
at this time?
yeah,
And that he had that much influence?
yeah. Absolutely. God was using Paul. Don, I think that tells us we can be used of God too. We're not prisoners. Or maybe we are. When I got back to Wilmington, got there Wednesday evening, and a buddy of mine found I was in town. He said, hey, another friend of ours, Nathan Sanders, says he holds a Bible study every Wednesday night. I said, how would you like to come? I said, absolutely. He said, just meet me there. So I knew where the church was. So I got in there, and there was probably 100 men at this Bible study. And I saw some that I knew when I lived down there. But I was talking to one of my other buddies about it, about these guys, and they said that some of these guys have got more money than they know what to do with. Some of these guys have nothing. Some of these guys have been in prison. Some of these guys are headed to prison. He said, but everybody's equal. There was blind people there. There was those that could see. But I was quite impressed with what this guy did. And I can remember when Becky and I were down there, he was in my Sunday school class. And God has just blessed him immensely, and he's given back to God, sold out to God, kind of like Paul was, and it was just a blessing to be there and hear him talk and give a lesson. But we've got 276 people on this boat, that not one of them was lost. they're all going to get to continue to hear Paul preach and reflect Jesus. So, and when they had eaten enough, stop right there a minute. When they had eaten enough, they got all they wanted. What's another picture you see where people got all they wanted and there was left over? That's right, Harley, feeding of the 5,000. There's pictures all throughout the Bible of God just saying, look what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. I've got everything under control. But when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship. What does that mean, lightened the ship? Had they not thrown stuff overboard to this point?
No.
Yeah, I think they had.
Yeah.
I think so. I think they've been throwing all non-essentials over. Now, what's left are essentials.
It's the food.
And yeah, because it says they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat. What was the wheat for? Food.
Yeah.
So they're throwing all the food away. Now, why would you do that?
They had a plan.
They had a plan. Who did it involve? God. That's right. I think they're starting to see this God that you serve, Paul, knows what he's doing. Now, we've got to lighten this ship. Why?
To beach it.
To beach it. That's exactly right. They've got to get enough momentum on that ship to run it aground to make it stick. So they've got to get all the weight that they can off. Now, there's a lot of waiting people, but all those people are going to be saved. They can't be disposed of. So everything else is gone, including life-sustaining food. This God that Paul serves has brought us safe thus far. Why is he going to stop now? Childlike faith. That's what it takes. So they got rid of all this stuff. They threw it into the sea. And when it was day, they could now see. The lights come up. When it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek and a shore into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. They didn't know where they were. Obvious, because they've been floating around out there for 14 days, tossed to and fro by the waves. Now, the main sail was down, so the wind would be blowing them. The rudder was tied up so that it just tried to keep it still as they could. So there's a lot of things they did to prepare for this storm. When the light comes up, they don't know where they are. But as Conrad was pointing out, they were just off the island of Malta. Now, Malta was a stopping off point for sailors, but it was more further west than where they were. That's why they didn't recognize where they are right here. So it said, they discovered there was a certain creek with a shore into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust the ship. So they saw a creek, basically where water would rain and come off, water coming off of the island. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea. In other words, we're going for broke. We're putting this ship into the sea to go for what we want to do. And they loosed the rudder bands that were holding the rudder in place so that it wouldn't move. They loosed those, and then they hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and headed towards shore. Okay, so they prepared. Now, this is another reason why all of those people need to stay on the ship, because they were seasoned sailors. They knew what to do. They also needed strength to be able to do what they knew to do. So thus the food. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart struck fast and remained unmovable. So they got up some speed on that ship. They had the wind driving it. They took a lot of the weight off, so that thing was sailing, and they ran it straight to ground. And it, boom, hit that ground and stuck fast. What happened to the rear part of the ship? It broke up. says, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. It was still out there flailing around, and the waves were breaking it up. Now, you're grounded, but you're still out in the water. They were doing soundings, and they knew they were close to shore, and so they ran it and stuck it. But they're still out there in the water. Now the ship's breaking up. What do you do in a case like that? Get out of the ship. They stayed in the ship as long as they were supposed to be saved. Now it's time to get out, because the ship's going to break up, and they've got to do something. They ain't got no life boats. They got rid of them. So, as they look around and see what's going on, the soldiers' counsel to Julius was, we got to kill the prisoners. Why? Because they're going to escape. They already had plans to escape once, remember? And Paul told them, and they thwarted that plan. Now they're afraid they're going to escape again. And I got to thinking about that. What happens if you're in charge of prisoners and they escape? You're in trouble. Well, why couldn't you just say, hey, they drowned? You know, I could think of all kinds of excuses. But the soldiers' counsel was kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, Julius, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and made a decision where he commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and beat it to the land as best you can. And the rest, jump in, grab boards, broken pieces, whatever you can get a hold of, and kick like crazy, headed to the land. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Everybody was saved. All 276 people made it to land. None was lost. Now, once they got on there, how long did they stay? A while. They had to either repair that boat, get another one, or whatever. So what was Paul doing the whole time they were all there on Malta? Preaching Jesus. Now, do you think he had a captive audience? After they saw what God said and what God performed and did, they wanted to hear more. Don.
Another big factor here would be the promise. The promise.
Yep, exactly. It's a beautiful picture. Paul was always on mission. Always. No matter where he was or what was going on, he was on mission. And this is a beautiful story of how God preserved him. And there's all kind of other stories that it points towards. The ark, Lord's Supper, feeding of the 5,000. There's all kind of cool pictures in here. But it's how God works.
Great tribulation maybe too.
Yeah. That's right. There's all kind of pictures you see. All right, well, let's have a prayer. Father, once again, we just thank you for another day. We thank you for the lesson. We've enjoyed Acts, how exciting it was. We thank you for that. And now, Lord, we just pray that these requests that have been spoken and also the unspoken, that you would meet those, that you would touch, heal, and deliver, strengthen, and provide. We pray for our next service that you would speak to us the words we need to hear from our pastor. And we give you all the praise for it, Father, in Jesus' name, and amen.